you for the American Society for Information Science and Technology's 75th anniversary, and we're interviewing prominent figures in the field of library and information science. So we're lucky to have Bonnie's time today, Bonnie Cooper Carroll. And I have a series of questions I would like to just get you started with, and I'd like to encourage you to just carry on with these questions and tell us all that you can.
Okay, well, we've known each other a long time, so I'm sure you'll ask them. And you know whether I'll answer them.
That's right. All right, so the purpose of this interview is to give you a chance to talk about your career. We'd like to have that documented for the ASIS archives. Also to talk about your role in ASIS, since you were the president of ASIS in the 1980s, and to talk about your company a little bit. And you have some new news I'm hoping that we'll share with us when we get there. So the first thing is, I was remembering back a story that I probably shouldn't tell, but I will tell the story. I think it was your 40th birthday.
45th?
Maybe it was 45th, because you had your...
Only 3 years ago, right?
Was it that long ago? Oh my gosh. You had your nails painted, and we had a party at your house, and you had done your nails so that the numbers 4 and 5 were right together on that finger, and so whenever anybody asked you how old you were, you could show them. It was just a great story.
It's a very funny story, because yesterday I was with somebody who had gorgeous nails, and I told her that 45th story.
Yeah, that was a great story. Yes, I've been thinking of emulating that at some point.
When you turned 45.
When I turned 45 on my birthday. So, but I remember that you were born in October. I can't remember exactly what year, but you know for ASIS that we are giving birthdays. So you can just do October and the day. You don't have to give a year.
It's October 4th, 1947, and I'm proud of every year.
Good for you. Well, you don't look a day over 45, and I mean that absolutely sincerely. You do. You're great. So, no, I'm serious. Well, don't get me started. No, I'll take it. So, question is, tell me about when you grew up in New York City, is that right?
Outside of New York City.
Where did you grow up?
Long Island.
In Long Island? I didn't know you grew up in Long Island. Where in Long Island?
South Central Nassau County. Fillmore.
Okay. All right. That's good. Can you tell me about your parents and your siblings? What was your family? I met your dad. And
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I assume, the focus of this is kind of professionally, ultimately, and how you started and where you ended up.
Where did you start from?
So it's interesting because everybody talks about entrepreneurship, and I guess I've become an entrepreneur. But the fact is, I grew up in a very middle class home. My father was an engineer. My mother was a school teacher, and I never knew anything about politics. I never knew anything about entrepreneurship. It was a very sheltered environment. I don't know where this all came from, but that was the environment I grew up in. I have an older brother who is very close in age. People thought we were twins. He's a year and 10 months, but girls look older and boys. So for years it was Carrot Top. I was a redhead, so was he, and Bonnie. And then about 7 years later, my younger sister came. And that changed the family life and dynamics. But, I was off to college by the time she was 10 years old.
Wow.
So.
And you and Roy Cooper have been married now for quite a while.
31 years.
31 years. So that would be 19... Gosh, I can't believe that. That's a long time ago. I can't even count that far back. So, but in between the time that you grew up in Long Island, what did you do? You went, after you graduated from high school, you went to Cornell.
Right.
And what did you study?
Social psychology. And that was a very traditional thing to do. You grew up in New York City area, and then you wanted to go up to Cornell, the great school on the hill, and you went there, and then I got my degree there. Actually, I got my degree in 3.5 years. And a girlfriend and I, we've remained friends since we were both 14 years old. Our careers and our lives followed each other. We both graduated early, and then we took off and went traveling for 3 months together, and then I went on for another 3 months. And then when I left, I said, well, I'm applying to library school, and I'm sure we'll get to why. And if I get in when I get back, I'll have something to do. If not, I'll come back and find a job. And that's what I did, and I got into library school with a full fellowship. and Title IIB fellowship. And so when I came back, I went to Columbia University, and did my graduate program there.
So when you went traveling, where all did you go?
Barbara and I went all over Southern Europe. We went down to Africa, so that added a continent to my life list. And then all through to Italy, and then she had to go back for her brother's wedding, and I went on to Israel. And so she went back through France, and I spent 2 months in Israel, and then went to Scandinavia for a month, and then came back to the States, and then started graduate school in the fall. We left in March of 1961.
Wow, that's quite a trip to take. So 6 months of traveling.
That's right.
On top of
with $300 in my pocket.
And how much did you come back with?
No, I mean, I was fine with $300 for 6 months.
That's great. Couldn't do it now. Well, that's great.
Yeah, we were quite adventurous, and we hitchhiked and did all kinds of interesting things.
We don't let your mother do that.
Right.
So you traveled around, then you came back, and you went to Columbia. What in the world possessed you to decide to apply to a library school program?
Well, it was interesting. My mother was a school teacher and also a devotee of libraries. She loved the library. She loved the librarian. And I guess somehow in my background that stuck. But in fact, when I graduated from college, I figured I was going to go to law school. And I figured, well, I didn't have money to go to law school, so I would go and see if I could get a scholarship to library school fellowship. And then once I got that, I could earn a living while I was going to law school. And that was actually what I was thinking about doing. Well, I did get my library degree, and law school was not in the picture.
So what happened after you got your library degree?
Got married. That changes lives. So from Columbia, the man I married was a graduate student at Cornell. And so we got married, and then I went up to Cornell, and I actually worked at the undergraduate library in Cornell.
So
that was my first job.
Yeah, I noticed that. You were the assistant reference librarian or reference librarian?
In the undergraduate library at Cornell.
Assistant reference librarian.
And I'll never forget the day where, we were in the undergraduate library, and I was the reference librarian on in the evening, and there was kind of a big hallway with steps, and the kids used to congregate. Kids, they were 2 years younger than I was. And I once came out and I said, "Could you be quiet?" And one of them looked at me and said, "You must hate us kids." I'll never forget that. I had graduated,
You crossed the boundary.
Yeah, it was you're in a library. Yeah. Well, that was probably the last time that ever happened.
So then, you were after the reference librarian. What happened after that?
Well, I helped type a 100-page PhD thesis with a manual typewriter and a little whiteout. And then actually, my husband at the time he was a PhD chemist, and he was looking for a job. And it was in 1971. It was very bad times for scientists. And it took him a number of months, and he finally got a job at Oak Ridge National Laboratory. So I followed him down here.
So you went from
here being Oak Ridge, Tennessee, is
right.
where we are. Right.
And so you left the academic reference department, and you came to Oak Ridge. And what did you do?
Jobless.
Yeah, jobless. So what did you do when you got here? But that was quite a culture shock.
Oh yeah, it was a culture shock the day we drove into Tennessee. We slept in the Tri-Cities area, Virginia and Tennessee meet, and we woke up in the morning and there was snow on the ground. Now, coming from Ithaca, New York, snow on the ground was no big deal.
Right.
But being in Tennessee, snow on the ground, and I said, "Where did you bring me? Where are we coming?" But we got to Oak Ridge, and we stayed with some people that my husband Yair Talmy had met, and they were wonderful, warm people, very cultured people. It's a very cultured town. It was an oasis at the time in the middle of nowhere, but there were PhDs from all over the country and all over the world. And so we made our way, but we rented a house, and for a couple of weeks I was just looking for a job, and then it got to the point where I turned on the soap operas. And after about 3 days of that, I told my husband, I said, "You've got to help me find a job. I cannot do this." And sure enough, the Oak Ridge National Laboratory librarian at the time was at the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna on an assignment for 2 years. So they actually had a slot open, not for the director of the library, of course, but they had a position open for 2 years. And so I took the job. I was the reference librarian at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, Science Library.
Now, that was in 1971?
It was 71, 71.
And so in 1971, the Oak Ridge National Laboratory was it more independent? You know, later on it had multiple libraries across the 3 Department of Energy facilities here.
Right.
At that time, was it just the one?
No. There was a central research library where I worked, but there was a biology library, there was a library at Y12 National Security Complex called Y12 Weapons Library at the time. And I think there was 1 or 2 other branches at the time. Yeah.
So you went to Central Research Library.
I did.
In the CRL.
That's right. You did a time there too.
Yeah, I did my time.
That's right. That's right. We both know Bob Conrad, who is still there.
Right. That's right. So you worked at Central Research Library as an information specialist.
A librarian.
Yeah, they call it librarian. Now, at that point, you had had some experience between reference in an academic setting and now reference at a special library. Any particular notices of differences in the jobs that you had?
Quite different, but I think a more interesting story is what actually happened. When I was in library school, I had a course in services in the sciences, the physical sciences. Jessica Milstead, who was her first year as a faculty member, and she was as scared as we were, and I was in her first class, and she was teaching us about the different policy documents that were coming out in science information. And she told us about the Weinberg Report. And I had read the Weinberg Report, and it made quite an impression on me, because it talked about librarianship not just being an archival place, but you really have to have information analysis centers where there really is work that's done where you help people find the knowledge. It's not about physical items, it's about knowledge and content. And so that report really stuck with me quite a bit, as well as other policy documents, which is where I think I got my first policy interest in scientific and technical information policy. So I had read the Weinberg Report, and Alvin Weinberg, who was director of Oak Ridge National Laboratory at the time, was a brilliant and wonderful man. And he used to have bi-monthly colloquia. And of course I was this full of energy young librarian, so I would go and voraciously absorb everything he was ever saying. And then I worked in this very traditional library. So one day, and he was a great library user. I mean, he was really wonderful. He asked a question about the Watt steam engine. I remember, and he was saying, how long did it take before the steam engine was replaced by new technology? Well, that's a tough reference question. And I stayed late, and I was trying to figure out if I could get anything that really could help him. And it was late that night, and I called his assistant, who was the gatekeeper to Dr. Weinberg's office, Elizabeth Richardson. And I said, I have a little information, I'm not sure I answered it. She says, well, why don't you come up here and tell him? And I said, okay. And so I went up, and I went into this hallowed ground, Dr. Weinberg's office, and he's a nice man, but his reputation was just absolutely incredible in this industry. And so I told him what I found, and he said, well, you're new here, and he started talking to me, and he said, well, what do you think? And I went and I said, I go to your colloquiums, and you talk about things, and I read the Weinberg Report. Why doesn't it start at home? What you're advocating. Here you have libraries, you have information centers, and there really isn't any real integration, and here to do some of the things you preached. And at the time, Francois Cortez was basically his staff assistant, a grand old man. These are some wonderful, wonderful old names who staffed that report. And so then that was the conversation. And then I came across and met someone who was in the Program Planning and Analysis Group, which was the strategic planning group for Dr. Weinberg, for Oak Ridge National Laboratory. And I was talking to him, and so he says, well, I heard you talk to Weinberg. So I told him the story, and he said, well, why don't you come up and talk to us? And basically, as a result of those kinds of conversations, they took me out of the library and sent me up to the Environmental Information Systems Office, which was a new program, research applied to national needs, where they created an environmental sciences division at Oak Ridge National Laboratory. And they had an information system. And so I spent a little time there and met some people that now are having a big impact on the company, including Larry Peck, who worked there at the time, who went on to build a $1.6 billion business for SAIC. And Larry is currently on our board of advisors here, so kind of it all has come full circle. And I spent a year and a half there, and then Cal Burwell, the man that I spoke to at the time, called me and asked me to come down and join the Program Planning and Analysis Group. And so I joined that group. So I had left the library, had gone into the very earliest of information systems. My orientation was always advanced information technology applied to libraries and information. And I ended up in this Program Planning and Analysis group. And there, you do all kinds of interesting studies. We did a study of the social sciences at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, because they weren't allowed to have social scientists at the time. It was all physical sciences. We did a study of food shortages. We did some really interesting kinds of things, and it really broadened my horizon in science policy. And they were encouraging of me to get involved. ARPANET was coming in, so they asked me to look into ARPANET and how could they use it at a national laboratory. And then in 1976, they actually sent me to Washington, D.C. for 3 months on an assignment to help ERDA, which was a predecessor of Department of Energy, create a strategic planning process for their national laboratories. So this was all this wonderful, wonderful exposure. And, as a young person, I had no decision authority, but I had a lot of interesting connections and input to very important processes.
Right, you had access to a lot of important people.
Yeah, and I remember one thing that greatly impressed them, which is so just a simple library problem. They were looking at black lung disease because, of course, the nuclear industry was under a lot of siege. And they were saying, well, let's look at the coal industry. And I went and I found an article that talked about the economic impact of black lung disease as a result of the liquefaction process in Germany during World War II. And everybody was so excited that somebody found this great, interesting information, and it was a reference question. That's what it was. So that kind of launched a little different process in my career. I've never worked in a library since, except I did spend 3 days in a library that my company transitioned from the government to a contractor run, where I actually spent 2 days doing a book inventory. On April Fool's Day in Montana, and it snowed. And Pat Powell, who we're having her retirement party tomorrow night, actually was the one that was running that contract, and she sent me there. And it was so that was the last time I actually worked in a library. There you go. But after that, I really went, rather than in librarianship, although we run libraries, and the knowledge I have as being a library and information professional has really extended into everything I do, that whole knowledge base. But I didn't work in libraries anymore. I went from Oak Ridge National Laboratory, the Program Planning and Analysis Group, and then went out into the private sector in a company kind of like mine. And then I had the opportunity in Oak Ridge to work for the Department of Energy itself at the Office of Scientific and Technical Information, which was exactly what I had been preparing for, because it brought together the whole knowledge base. How do you collect all the knowledge output of research and development program, the multi-billion-dollar program of the Department of Energy. I spent 7 years there.
Right.
And then I went out into the private sector, and then eventually, a year and a half later, that particular company didn't do so well, and so I was looking for what to do next, and I started Information International. It wasn't long after that you came and joined us.
That's right. That's right.
That's right.
First as a consultant, and I think that was in 1990 or 91, and then 92.
We won
the contract to input records for the Department of Energy Science and Technology.
Creating the database. We were the largest input source, not only to the Department of Energy's database, but also to the International Nuclear Information System, which was U.S. input to that system. Yeah, you managed that for us. And that, I was reflecting, since Pat's retirement is tomorrow night, on the kind of fun things that happened, and that's one of the things listed in there is the party we had when we found out we won.
And I remember we had a choice between
dessert at the Lakeside Grill.
We had a choice. You said, okay, I've looked at office space. Now that we won the contract, I've looked at office space. Here's the question for you, the management team. Would you rather have excellent office space with very nice offices or better salaries?
Did I ask you that?
You did.
Well, that was a
and it was
question.
unanimous. We all voted for the good salaries and forget the office space. But it was an okay.
I learned something. I've never asked that question today.
Well, but you have great dudes now.
And good salaries.
And good salaries. Yeah, you have it all.
Yeah, there you go.
I wanted to come back to something that you said about how breadth of knowledge, while you don't work in a library, it applies to a lot of library and information science, and this knowledge base that you have is a breadth building on the library and information science that you came in with as you grew into this science and information policy. I want to come back to that towards the end because I want to get you your ideas, so I just want to mark that as opposed to come back to it.
Well, you'll have to remember that.
Oh, I will.
I
have it written down. I won't forget. You were at the lab for a total of
7 years.
7 years, okay. So when you were there and they had invested in this, when you left, did you maintain contact with those people as you moved through the next few phases of your career?
With Oak Ridge National Laboratory?
And the people that you worked with? Alvin Weinberg, for example.
Well, of course, I knew Alvin, I didn't do business with him, but, until the day he died, I had interactions with him because a couple of years after that, we wanted to revisit the Weinberg report. And so we asked him to write his feelings about the Weinberg report revisited, and I remember he really was not aware of all the changes that had happened in the non-line stream. And so he reflected on that, and he actually wrote a paper as a result of our conversation with him on that. And, the people that I knew moved up into high positions at Oak Ridge National Laboratory. And some of them today, even as I'm now doing business, some of them with Oak Ridge National Laboratory, so some of that has helped me to know what's going on, to know people and things like that. So there have been connections. A lot of the most senior management, of course, now are in their late 80s.
Right.
So,
well, Alvin Weinberg died 3, 4 years ago.
More than that, but
Not too long ago. But I know that he was had quite an impression on the field of science in general, much less the life of Oak Ridge. I've met him a few times, but he was always a very gracious man. I knew that you guys were friends. I was reading through your resume, and I learned something new about you. That you actually did some coursework towards an MBA at the University of Tennessee. What was it that precipitated that? What would make you do that?
I guess I had an MLS and it was time to go learn something else, and they had an executive program in Oak Ridge, an extension in Oak Ridge, so I started taking courses. And actually it was very interesting because in one of my classes, everything is connected to everything in some way in this universe, but one of my classes, I can't even remember which class, it could have been economics, there was this guy that kept asking questions, and so I asked somebody, I said, who is that guy? And they said, oh, that's Herman Postma. He's division director of the Fusion Energy Division.
Which was Alan Weinberg's successor, is that right?
Herman Postma became the director of Oak Ridge National Laboratory while I was in the planning group. So we actually had that connection back from when I did my MBA. But at the time, and you know this, but it wasn't written particularly in my professional resume, but I was also an actress when I first came to Oak Ridge.
Yes, I did know that. That's right.
And so at the time, I was working full-time, I was in plays, and I was doing my, courses toward my MBA, and it just got to be more than I could do, so I never actually pursued the degree in the end. I just got involved.
Through your MBA over for the acting?
Yeah, well, not exactly. I also taught at the library school.
Yes, I know you did that. What did
Twice,
you teach?
so yeah. Sources and services in the physical sciences.
Both times that you taught?
No, the second time I think I taught science, something more related to science policy and things, but it was again in the science information. Yeah, so no.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. And while you were at Austin, so you went to Oak Ridge National Laboratory, and then you had a brief stint at the Franklin Research Center. Is that
Right, Franklin Research Institute.
Okay, and what was that?
Well, they were a government contractor that did contracts for the government, very much like my company does today. Yeah.
And then you went to Austin. And while you were at Austin, you were involved in some international work.
A lot of international. I was the assistant manager for program planning and international activities for a while. And we did a lot of work with the International Atomic Energy Agency because the International Nuclear Information System, the U.S. and OSTI was the U.S. National Representative to us. And of course we helped produce the U.S. portion that went into that international database.
Right.
The things that you and I had done in Oak Ridge that other people were doing and we were managing.
Right. And also during that time was when you served as the ACES president.
Right.
There's a lot to do at that time. So you had some international stuff going on with your work at Austin, but you were also traveling during the time that you were ACES president, because I remember the day you came to Tennessee to talk at the university with the students, you were getting ready to go, I want to say, to Thailand or somewhere in Southeast Asia is what I remember. I don't know if you remember this.
I'm trying to think of what.
This was, oh gosh, a long time
but
ago.
no, but it was 1985 when I was president.
Yeah.
At that time, the Taiwanese invited the ACES president to come and give lectures there. And so we went and we spent a week in Taiwan giving lectures, and then my husband, my current husband, and I, we missed that little portion of what happened. Nothing bad, just different ways. We went, and then we took another week or 10 days and went to Thailand and Burma. So that's where I was going at that
Because I
time.
remember that.
Yeah.
That you were getting ready,
Yeah.
like maybe that afternoon or the next day, you were getting ready to
Could have
go.
been. Could have been.
So during, in reflecting back on the year that you were the ACES president that year, what stands out as important or of note to you about that year?
Well, one of the very interesting things in that time, the concept of email was just beginning. And at the time, there was something, I'm trying to remember, the New Jersey Institute of Technology had something called the Planet System. And they allowed ACES to use that, and it was an email system. And there was another one, I don't know whether it was through ARPA, I'm not remembering, there was another system that was only used mainly by universities and everything. But I actually used the Planet System to communicate with the executive committee of ACES. And it was the first time I and most people had ever really used email, and that's when I got my first exposure of you send once too many. and that kind of thing. Well, it was an experiment, and there was no particular continuity after the year that we did it, but it really left quite an impression on me, having tried to do that. There was also a lot of change going on in terms of the executive director, the ACES' history about that time. Well, certainly I hope I did a good job and had an impact on ACES. I remember believing very definitely that the president of ACES should have a kind of a platform and some goals and things like that. It was a time of change in the 1980s, and so we looked at the challenges, and I wrote an article in the bulletin about the challenges and everything. I should have gone back and reviewed that before we had this interview. Had I not been crazy the last month, I would have done that, because that really would reflect all the things we were thinking about at the time. But I was very serious at the time. I was a young, energetic woman. I was very young, yeah. And so I had great ideas and great aspirations for doing some things, and I summarized them in that. I don't remember what they were, but I remember I summarized them very well.
Yeah. Well, I remember a lot when you spoke at that as a student. I remember you talking about some of the international aspects of information and things that you were interested in getting ready to do. And you talked about some of the fundamental concepts as you were talking to the students, how they were important in so many other areas of life that perhaps students hadn't really thought about. That's what I
did. Glad you remembered a lot of those things.
You made quite an impression on me. It changed. If I hadn't been going in the direction I was going, it would have brought me over that meeting. It was really an interesting talk. I still remember it for many reasons.
I know the Coke story.
I'll always remind you of that. So when you were at Oak Ridge at the lab at Ornell, you did not have email. But after your presidency and the planet system, and you got to Austin, that was probably right around in there. Well, you were already Austin, but about the time you got done with your presidency would be about the time that Austin was having email.
86?
Yeah, that's what I'm remembering, because the lab got email in 86. Because I was thinking 86.
I'm not remembering that was such a significant impact. It was in the course of technology change. But I do remember while I was at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, and I have a wonderful chart about all the changes in technology. It was only in the 1980s that the first personal computers were there. And Herman Postma made a pronouncement that they would only have one personal computer at Oak Ridge National Laboratory. And so you can see how times have changed.
Yeah. I remember getting my first 10 megabyte hard drive, thinking that
enormous.
It was huge.
The whole world could be there.
So I could put the fisheries database in Simate.
Mm-hmm.
I could put the whole thing on that hard drive. That was really something. Yeah, it's quite a few changes. What was it that made you decide to join ACES and get involved?
Well, I was always oriented toward professional activities. I don't know what drove me particularly to ACES. I can't quite remember, but I do remember my first ACES National Annual Conference was in Atlanta, and it was in 1979, and I drove down to Atlanta with Jim Cape, who worked at OSTI at the time, and I didn't, of course, and I had a wonderful time, and I went to the SIG cabinet, and that's what really got me involved. I just was so frustrated at what I was hearing, and of course I had a better way to do it, and so I stood up and spoke about the better way to do it, and of course at the time, the cabinet and the council, they were kind of a little bit sleepy about that time, and before I knew it, I was elected the SIG cabinet counselor. And of course, that was a national level position, and that's what kind of sucked me in to all things ACES.
Mm-hmm.
And that was, I guess, 79, and then in 85, I ran for president. don't remember step by step how that happened, but it did. Facts show it.
Talked about things,
Right.
yeah.
Right. But we worked hard. I mean, we really worked hard on the SIG structure. I think we're still working hard on the SIG structure and how that operates within ACES.
Yeah, that's true. That's right. And you also went on to win the Watson Davis Award.
For service to the society. I think you just get on that mill and you just keep going. Just doing a lot of things. It was great times, and ACES really was a big influence. I remember at the time, and people you met and everything, and I've just lost his name, the director of Chem Abstracts, Dale, he was the director of Chemical Abstract Service. Dale, oh dear, well, it'll come back to me.
Yeah.
Anyway, Chem Abstracts was the big information system. It was the big vendor of science information. And he once said being president of ACES was worth $10 million.
Wow.
Because of the contacts and the things that happened as a result of it. And that may be true. Maybe true. Dale Baker. Thank you.
Right.
Dale Baker. Right.
And you know that when I was at Sheffield, Peter Willett, who was the head of the department there, is well known for his work in chemoinformatics, which is uses lots and lots of ACES data, and modeling and working with
structures and vocabularies and
Right. It's amazing what's going on there. The work in ACES now is because it's always been an international organization, and of course they've changed their name. One of the names on the list of possibilities was the International Society for Information Science, as opposed to the American Society for Information Science and Technology. And that debate is long gone. It's not an issue at this point, but there is the establishment of the International Relations Committee in the last 4 or 5 years, and one of their primary focus areas is to develop relationships and partnerships with sister organizations internationally, so that there are shared benefits of conferences and memberships across the different societies in the you've worked a lot with ICSD internationally and whatnot. What is your feeling about the internationalization of information?
It's there. It exists. Knowledge doesn't know boundaries. And so the more you can interact with like communities of practice, the communities of practice in all fields are international, and especially in the information sciences. Science doesn't know geographic boundaries. So it's, the more you can cooperate and leverage each other's capabilities, that's always the better way to go. I believe that. I've always tried to live that, and I think it's true. But it's also interesting with China rising and with India rising, one starts to think about the balances on the kinds of things when they have, their percentage of geniuses and their percentage of PhDs, the numbers are just absolutely overwhelming when you got 1 billion people. And so, it causes you to worry a little bit and think about rethinking, but then you always come back to openness is really, in the end, going to be the way to go. So I haven't changed my mind on that yet.
When you were president, and also the year leading up to your presidency and the past president, you get 3 years to affect change. And in those 3 years, was there anything that struck you as things you might like to have done that you didn't feel like you had either time to do or just didn't have the opportunity to do in those 3 years that you'd like to do?
Well, the perennial challenge to ACES was membership. And ACES is a society that's an umbrella society. Everyone has some specialties, but ACES is kind of the place that you go for your kind of intellectual stimulation. Not necessarily like SLA, people get practical kinds of things. At least that's the way it was in the mid-'80s. So there was always a challenge of membership development. And we did studies of what members want and the nature of our membership. Don King was very involved in those kinds of things. So, you always have regrets that you weren't able to raise the membership numbers higher than they were at the time. But ACES was always a very exciting place where there were a lot of very interesting thinkers about what was going on.
Mm-hmm. I think that the membership issue is still
always. Well, now it's even worse because, limited funds, people, the competition for mind share and time share of people's lives is just incredible today. You're never off, you're on 24/7, and people just don't have the energies. I know the local chapters, it's hard to get people to come to meetings everywhere.
Right.
So there's some real challenges in that. So that's always, it's not going to get much better.
Yeah.
The other thing I remember that I think it's definitely a bigger challenge today, but the federal sector representation in ACES, meaning federal employees that were involved in these kinds of things. When in 1979, when I first went to ACES, the greats of the information profession were all there at the annual meetings, and just being there and meeting them. And I always thought of ACES and professional societies as opportunity to jump hierarchies. Mm-hmm. I mean, you'd never talk to the deputy director of the National Library of Medicine if you were a kid.
Right.
Because it was impossible. You were too low a level. You never got up there. You go to an organization like ACES, and your peers, in a sense, you can go talk to anyone. You start working on committees that they're the chairman of, and you can impress people in different ways. That you just jump the hierarchies of institutional structures. And so for me, meeting all these federal people was really career enriching. It really was, both by the association with them as well as just getting to know them and to be able to say, oh yeah, I was talking to Melda, I was talking to these various people, and you were. I mean, it was a real thing. So what disappointed me and continued to was the loss of the participation of federal managers of information in ACES. And at one point, a couple of years, we tried to do something with that. Actually, now, with the scientific data activities, there's a very rich target. The federal government is doing incredibly good thinking and activities on scientific data management. And ACES is doing some things like that. And that's a perfect opportunity to start re-engaging federal information managers and information professionals. So that was something I think that was disappointing to me back then, and maybe continues to be an opportunity and a challenge.
Where, in your opinion, do the federal managers today, the information managers today, go to share their ideas together? If not at ACES, where are they doing it?
Well, we've been the executive secretariat for an interagency group of 14 federal science and technology agencies, where the heads of those organizations meet and they share their ideas in those kind of environments. And it would be very hard to get them to ACES meetings because there's not enough focused attention on things that would be relevant to them. Some of it is just too technical. ACES is much too technical for the senior managerial levels. Okay, so I don't know whether you can make a track that would keep them involved for 2 days. Something like that. So there are a lot of more targeted associations. A lot of them participate in ICSTE. Actually, ICSTE is an organization that does attract the federal sector.
And that's the International Council on
for Scientific and Technical Information.
And that's the European counterpart to
No, it's international. It is. It started as the International Council for Science, ICSU, International Council for Scientific Unions, which became ICSU, the International Council for Science. They had two groups that were interested in information. One was CODATA, Committee on Data, and the other one was ICSU Abstracting Board. So that dealt with the documents. The Abstracting Board became ICSTE, but the time that change was effected, ICSU was it's an association of academies of sciences, and they did not want to allow membership of the commercial sector. So ICSTE was very much founded on the relationship between publishers and the governments and things like that. So they were, commercial publishers were an integral part. So they kind of had to break off. They became kind of first cousins. And they still have that kind of first cousin relationship, whereas CODATA is more an integral part of ICSTE. But for international scientific and technical information, those are, in my sphere of activity, those are the two major places where people gather and talk about common issues.
How did ACES fit in did it have a role in the way that you feel like your career developed that brought you, now that we've led up to IIA, to the establishment of this company?
Well, this company is based on the management of scientific and technical information. I don't know if you can see the backdrop, and navigators in a sea of data. So the company was first formed in the experience that I had personally and professionally. And scientific and technical information, the fundamentals of librarianship, understanding the structure of knowledge, and how people need and use and communicate knowledge and things like that were very fundamental. And ACES was very fundamental in my own development and understanding, and the contact base and the exposures and things like that. So, it was just an integral part. I mentioned the jumping of hierarchies, just meeting these people, just, having the associations of people that you never would have as a young professional had if you stayed within your institutional structure. So it was very influential, and that and the places that I worked all added up to contacts, because you go into business, it's based on who wants to engage you to do work for them. Well, having the experience and knowledge of what their needs were, like in the case of the Department of Energy's Office of Scientific and Technical Information, they're our best client today, because we have a common understanding of where we're going, and we can well support them. So, is that kind of the answer?
Yes, and also what I'd like to do is to follow up a little bit more on the work that you do with CENDI, and if you would explain what CENDI is, and maybe talk a little bit about what kinds of activities you do for CENDI as the executive director.
Okay, well, CENDI is kind of a flagship contract. It's a small contract. It's very small. Not even like 1% of their business, but it's a very mighty contract. It really exposes you, and it helps you in thought leadership, which then you bring to the operating contracts that are the real bread and butter of the company. But it's this knowledge and thought leadership of what's going on in your business. But I'll tell you a little bit more about, you said you wanted to know something about IIA, because we do more than just this part of the information business. So we can talk about that maybe a little later. So, okay, so where were we?
I was just curious. I wanted you to start with CENDI.
Okay, CENDI, sorry. So when I worked at the Department of Energy's Office of Scientific and Technical Information, there was, under Andy Ames, and for many years, there was something called COSATI, which is the Committee on Scientific and Technical Information, and the Weinberg Report had influence on that. So within the federal government, there was this kind of organization on scientific and technical information. And the managers of the centralized systems of the major science and technology agencies, meaning Defense with the Defense Technical Information Center, NASA with the NASA STI program, and Energy with the Office of Scientific and Technical Information, and then NTIS in the Department of Commerce, which was cross-cutting public access to the results that each of these collection centers managed for their own missions. Those managers had a lot in common, because back then everything wasn't virtual. You built your own silo of a database, because that was pretty advanced when you were building electronic databases. And then material science, well, NASA did material science, DOD did material science, DOE did material science, and other agencies, NTIS was collecting miscellaneous other NSF. Of course, NSF published journal literature, more than technical reports. But these managers wanted to share information. So material science they would get from the Department of Defense re-index it so that it was exactly relevant to Department of Energy interests. But there was a lot of exchange of that kind. So there was a natural need for these people to think together and communicate together. And so I worked at OSTI, its predecessor. Its name was not OSTI at the time. I watched the manager, Joe Coyne, meet with his counterparts. And I was the strategic planner for OSTI. And I said, well, could I invite, one time when you're meeting, they rotated around, when you meet down here, could I invite the strategic planners so we can all talk about what we're thinking and what we're doing? And we did that. And we had a great meeting. And of course, we were organized, active, and we came to give things to these principals. And it came to be that they said, well, why don't we meet together? And why don't you staff our activities? Because we were quite organized with all of that. And that became a new organization, which was called CENDI, after Commerce, Energy, NASA, and Defense Information. And so we formalized this kind of informal meeting. And then I left the Department of Energy, so I left it, but it had been formalized in MOUs, and National Library of Medicine was the 5th agency that joined. That was back in 1986. And then I left, and then the chairmanship rotated, and it was staffed by the planners, but in a fairly rotating, informal way. And they decided they wanted to pay somebody to keep them organized. And so they tried to do that through one of the agencies offering up a person. Everybody contributed a little bit of money. And that wasn't working perfectly well. And by that time I had started IIA and looking for work. So I was talking to Joe Coyne, and I said, well, Joe, if you have money you're going to pay somebody, why don't you pay me? I know how to do all this. I was involved in it. And that became the first CENDI contract. And the purpose of it was to create coordination. So it was a group of peers, the principals, who were the senior people, and alternates, who were essentially the planners at the time, or whoever they wanted to appoint, but it was the planners, to get together, to exchange ideas, to look strategically at where their missions were going, to see how they can leverage activities and things. And so that was, a year later, or so that would have been 89, something like that. And we got our first contract to manage this whole process. Well, this many years later, however, we still have that contract. I mean, it's been different contracts, competitively won, but of course we had so much knowledge and so much vision from them of where they were going that we continue to do that contract. And today, CENDI is 14 agencies. So it's 97% of the federal R&D budget. The agencies that participate in that really do represent the federal R&D funding. And we continue to have the same principles. How do you improve the science mission of the federal government through more effective use of information? So we're still doing that, and we do that by having, bi-monthly meetings where we bring in good speakers that are of interest, looking at what's coming out from technology to policy. We hold workshops for education. We have 3 goals. One is the leadership, bringing together the leadership in scientific and technical information. We have projects, and I'll come back to that. And then we have education, where we educate both internally, our agencies, staff, as well as the community. So we have lots of workshops that we put on. And the middle thing was the projects, doing projects together. Well, it was very hard to get anybody off of their legacy system to do new things. But under the leadership of the Department of Energy, a little bit under, and then Agriculture and the U.S. Geological Survey, DOE sponsored a workshop to look at what should be done in the future of science information systems. And as a result of that, because OSTI had an interesting technology of federated search, which back then was very new and exciting. Today it's pretty normal, but there's a technology and a vendor that, Deep Web Technologies, that has been very effective. We created science.gov, which is an interagency portal. And the principle of the federated search engine was you don't have to change your legacy system, your silo. This will go out to various silos and will homogenize it and bring the data back. So it was the least at the service provider end, but it optimizes the silos. Well, that's completely consistent with open government and everything else that's going on. Is, a user doesn't have to know that if you want environmental science or material science, you have to go to DOE, NSF, DOD, NASA. They all do these things. Well, how does a poor public citizen, even an educated scientific citizen, know that? So science.gov crosses all those portals, and that's been a wonderfully successful joint project. It's really done on the shoulders of the Department of Energy. They really stepped up to the leadership, but all the agencies participate, and there's a policy group called the Science.gov Alliance that is chaired by National Library, the National Agricultural Library was USGS, and now it's the Government Printing Office. So that continues, and the same technology. They actually, it was Eleanor Frierson was very active internationally, and she said, well, we had a science portal. Some other countries have a science portal. Wouldn't it be great if we could share our portals and ratchet that up one level to have an international science.gov? And with DOE's leadership again, and this one was instead of through CENDI, it was actually through ICSTE as a sponsor. They created Worldwide Science.gov, which now covers all of the continents except Antarctica, and I don't know the exact number of databases. I think 60 countries are covered, where there is a cross-silo search of scientific and technical information. So that started from the CENDI cooperative activity to a Science.gov, which is a CENDI platform, a CENDI project, and then it has gone international. So those are the kinds of things that CENDI has been involved in. We get very involved with policy. We're now working on a grand challenge, which is, in tight times, how do you justify what you're doing? What's the vision of the future? How do you build a knowledge infrastructure for the next generation? How do you take that Science.gov platform as it is today without any new money, looking at what every agency does, and how can they bring something back to the table to increment the platform we have to bring it into the next generation. So that's kind of the agenda. Formulating it was up to now, and now the agenda is next year is how we can actually do it.
What's the answer?
Well, on November 30th, 2011, since God knows when this tape will be watched, we're going to have a workshop on institutional repositories and look at what role repositories will play in the knowledge infrastructure of the future. And that's a joint workshop between the National NFACE, National Federation of Advanced Information Services, and CENDI, because we have this annual workshop together where, you said international. Well, we started with national. We also have a partnership with ICSTE, and we're trying to combine those, just like ACES could be part of that. In fact, at one point we thought about having an STI summit, where ACES would be at the table, ICSTE, NFACE, CENDI, all of these, because we all have such common agendas and so many things. But that just has taken second place to other things and budget cuts. And, it's a dream I have. Someday we'll maybe do it. Yeah. Well, IMLS is a funding agency, but they certainly might be interested in participating.
Sure.
Yeah, another interesting thing about CENDI that occurred to me, originally it was 4 executive branch mission agencies, 5 with NLM, and today we also have involved the legislative side, where Library of Congress has joined, and NARA, which is not a science agency, which is an executive branch, and GPO, but they're cross-cutting, kind of like an ENTIS mode. So there's a slice of them that's science and technology, but there's another slice that crosses the entire federal information sector.
So they've joined.
They've joined with CENDI, and it's both a blessing and a curse, because the more you get diverse, the less you can be focused, but it's always nice to then get that diversity of opinion and knowledge base and expertise. But it is a go-to place when the White House Science Office, and even when legislation is going on, and they need not policy, because these agencies do not make these organizations don't make policy for their agencies, but they can provide technical input to the impacts of policy. And people come to CENDI to talk to 14 agencies at the table. And there aren't a lot of venues where you can have conversations with that much expertise across the whole federal government when it comes to information management. So that's kind of one of CENDI's signature roles. Yeah.
You also mentioned projects.
Well, science.gov is the major
Okay.
project, but we also have working groups, and we also have these kind of focused discussions, special projects like how is every agency handling personally identifiable information? Okay, that's a problem across the agency. So we'll have a series of teleconferences where we'll be talking about it, where people will give their algorithms and we'll exchange things like that. So that's the kind of project work. It's very hard to get real projects, and science.gov is more than enough
Oh, sure.
for one. So it's more information exchange, knowledge exchange, and sometimes that breeds, well, let me borrow your algorithm and things like that. So that kind of thing happens on a bilateral and multilateral basis as opposed to all of Cindy doing something.
So now that you've tapped into the largesse of scientific knowledge, scientific and technical information knowledge in the U.S., what else is RLA doing? How does that relate to the other projects?
Oh, do I love to talk? That's a perfect question for the president of an organization. So maybe history is a good way to describe what we really do. We started as an STI organization. Cindy was one of our flagships. You were involved. We were processing, input processing information into the Energy Science and Technology database. It used to be that content and technology were divisible. You know, you had print, so you created content, and then you applied technology for the distribution of these things. With personal computers, with the internet, with the online industry, everything had become digits. And so the division, and everything was digital from cradle to grave. The division between content and technology didn't exist anymore. Those lines were very blurred. So a company that's in information management had to also be in information technology management. And so we diversified from being content-oriented. So a lot of the things we did in the beginning with database building, we ran libraries. At one time we were running 12 libraries across the federal government. They outsourced their libraries and we were running them. We had a wonderful business, but you have to understand the arcane conditions of government contracting. Once you get over a certain size, 7 million gross revenues, you can't bid on these things anymore. You're foreclosed from winning these kinds of contracts. So we were foreclosed from staying in the library business. But this is how the library business grew into other businesses, using a lot of the fundamental concepts that you get out of School of Library and now Information Science. First thing we did, because we were working with NASA at the time, and we were looking at foreign acquisition, so we got into doing foreign acquisition workshops. And the intelligence community got interested in that. And as a result of a lot of those contacts, we started doing open source intelligence. Well, what's that? That's just great research libraries. But open source intelligence was a whole industry in the intelligence community. And I remember we did, it was actually for an open part of the CIA called the COSMO, Community Open Source Program Office. We got a contract to tell them, God, I don't know what year it was, it must have been the early 90s. How can the internet be used for intelligence? Because nobody understood this internet. Alta Vista was just coming out.
Yeah.
I mean, and so we did a study of how this could be used. So we got involved in the intelligence community doing a lot of open source work. So we had STI, we had the intelligence, and then we also started doing information technology projects, always with a focus on the intersection of content and technology. And that's how we differentiate ourselves from a lot of the companies that exist around the Beltway in different places that, you know, are software engineers. You know, we really do better when we're integrating the knowledge base and the technology. But we got into information technology management, and today, for the Office of Scientific and Technical Information, we run their entire infrastructure. So we're their primary contractor that helps them run their infrastructure. And that's one of our very successful and our largest contracts. And we're doing that today. So, and that's very technology. I mean, we have computer scientists, and we have systems engineers, and we have systems administration. We run the infrastructure, we run the data center. So we are in the information technology, and we do other data centers, data information kinds of work. So, so another thing that happened, and this actually, well, was parallel with information technologies, is since we were in 12 Air Force bases, and we were, of course, we had a great reputation in all the bases, other contracts began coming out in managing the education and training programs. Well, libraries and education and training were closely related, so we started winning contracts in running that. And that was a combination of IT. It was the client side of major Air Force systems. How do you deliver it to the bases and run reports and stuff? And it was also, you know, managing, doing actually educational counseling things. So we developed a very successful program in education and training for the Air Force, running those programs. So we still have a practice in that. The government is outsourcing that. So again, we may have to move on, but we're still doing some very good things. We have work in the UK, and we were doing a lot of work in Germany when they brought that back in-house because of the government decision to take things back in-house. So we had education and training. We were running libraries. That's a declining business. The intelligence business was a thriving business in open source, and we were doing information technology work. And then we were very fortunate to have a key hire, and that's Leslie Mitchell, who came out of the intelligence community. She's our division director, and she has been wonderful, and she has helped us take the base that we had in open source intelligence and our associational intelligence community and jump over the fence and actually start doing analysis with them. So not only we were doing collection, and we were doing pre-analytical work. When we did collections, we did medical infrastructure studies for, well, over 200 of them, over 120 countries. What's the medical infrastructure in Iraq? What's the medical infrastructure in Somalia and Rwanda? And we found knowledge that the experts don't find, because the experts know the depth, but they don't know how to collect information they don't know about. And so we fulfilled that role for about 12 years. We were doing medical information studies all over the world. But we never actually did, and we did pre-analytical. You know, we kind of concluded some things, but we didn't apply it to make it actionable. That's the analyst's job, to make the recommendations. Well, now we've actually jumped that fence and are actually doing more and more work in the intelligence community, in the analysis as well as the open source intelligence, which we still do a lot of. So our and this is the heart of ACES, is the information sciences. That gap that exists between content libraries, librarianship, and computer science. There's the information science. The link between the technology and the content is the information sciences. The knowledge management. Now, a lot of people interpret that differently, but to me, knowledge management is the taking of that and the merging of those disciplines to make knowledge useful and actionable. Navigators in the sea of data. And so today we do work in 3 divisions: for civilian agencies, for defense agencies, and for intelligence agencies, because each of those are client-facing, and each of those clients are very different in character. The kinds of things we serve to them are information technology services, knowledge management, knowledge organization, knowledge systems services, and I'm forgetting my third service, and content-based kinds of information services. And so, you know, those are kind of the areas, and research and analysis kinds of services. So those are the services today we supply as a company. So that's where the company is today.
So clearly then, when you're bringing in people for new hires and some of the projects that you're working on, you clearly have a need for technology people, computer programmers,
right,
and software
information architects.
Also, you have need for people who have librarian skills, the traditional understanding of the way that information is organized.
The traditional modern understanding of the way things work. Absolutely.
And where do you find your staff that fall into that second category? Where do you bring them from? What kinds of educational backgrounds are you looking for?
Well, depending, you know, on those kinds of disciplines, We have a very close relationship with the College of Communications and Information, which was just at the University of Tennessee. There used to be a School of Library and Information Science, and it was combined with the School of Journalism and the School of Public Relations, and now it's the College of Communications and Information. I've been on the board of advisors, and we have very close relationships. Students do practicums. We hire a lot of the students that do practicums with us, and we hire them here. Some of them stay here. We send some of them to Washington. Some of them go to Washington and then come back here, and we've been having a very successful relationship there. Also, I send things out to my colleagues in the library schools and the professional communities when I have need for people. We use the networks and things like that. But when we're doing an IT project, then we're searching for people with that computer science expertise. When we do library and information contracts, we often search for librarians. Sometimes, right now, I'm looking for a scientific and technical information manager. I'd love to have an MLS librarian who has worked in scientific and technical information, because it's not a library traditional job, but it needs those skills as well as the skills of managing information. Another area that we've done a lot of work in, and this is kind of classic combination, when you look at science informatics, that's a discipline with informatics applied to it. Did a lot of work in biodiversity informatics for the U.S. Geological Survey. And there we hired librarians, information scientists, computer scientists, and biologists to help build a national infrastructure for biodiversity information. And that's kind of where our forte is, bringing those fields together to get information for decision making. So,
how well do you feel that the people that you bring in as interns from the Library and Information Science programs, how well prepared do you feel like they are for these kinds of new activities and outside the traditional bounds of what we think of as librarianship?
We're finding they do very well. I don't know whether it's just the ones that already come to us as practicums have orientations that way. I mean, if you want to be a public librarian, a public school librarian, or a public library librarian, or even an academic librarian, although a lot of people start in academic librarianship and really get into these other areas.
Right.
But if you wanted to be a public librarian, you wouldn't come and do a practicum with us. So we're already pre-selecting by people who want to come out and do work with us, people who are interested in non-traditional. Although today, non-traditional may be becoming traditional in people graduating from the schools of library and information science.
Right.
So fairly well, and some of them are wonderfully prepared. Some of them are pulling us along. Young people today are born digital. They're digital natives, and so a lot of them pull us along. So we find it's been a very positive, satisfactory relationship. And I love hiring people that come out with MLSs. I think they're well qualified to do a lot of things that we do.
So what would you say then, in the sum of looking over the career, starting all the way from assistant reference librarian at Cornell, all the way through to being the president and CEO, is that correct? Of such a preeminent and important information science and information resources.
Can I use that quote in their next bid?
Sure, you can. In all those experiences that you've had, what do you now, standing back, looking at everything we've talked about, we've said, what do you identify as maybe the top few issues in the field today, information management, information quality?
I kind of go back to some of the things we're thinking about in Sandy. Because information it's like air. You breathe it, and it's only when you don't have it that you recognize the value of it. And so one of the real challenges in this very information literate world, this Googleized world, where everyone has the expectation that information is free and it's all there, and and people have really been dumbed down in terms of real understanding of research and quality of data, comprehensiveness of data, in precision as well as recall. They just, if it's on Google, they got it, and Wikipedia and things like that. So one of the exciting things and challenging things is, how do you make a business case for effectively managing information? Because, especially, and I'm talking like from Cindy perspective, how the government agencies are feeling, which impacts the company directly, which impacts librarianship extensively in libraries. What's the value of a library, an information center, or whatever? We can just go to Google. Well, you can prove over and over again, yes, you can, but you may not get the best information. You're being penny wise and pound very foolish in that search for the right knowledge, depending on the problem you have at hand. So that's one thing that I think is very important, is understanding the impacts. We were told by OSTP, everything you do, you have to prove you can do jobs. Of course, we're in the federal government space, and so how do you do jobs is very important. So we looked at that problem. That was part of this grand challenge that Cindy is trying to identify. How do you show iScience to jobs? Okay, you're funding billions of dollars, 150 billion of research in the federal government. How do you prove that it's had an impact over here? Well, first, even proving investments in science is hard enough. Okay, but you wouldn't have an internet, you wouldn't have Google, you wouldn't have a lot of things if there weren't. You wouldn't have anything modern today. You wouldn't have Velcro if you didn't have, science agencies producing things. Although NASA apparently didn't invent Velcro, or we think it did, or something like that. But how do you prove that? And then compound that by the fact, what's the role of information in that proof? Okay, how do you prove that effective management information has a return on investment? And that's an awfully hard thing to do. And I've never seen anybody do it effectively. Don King and Marie Griffith have done a lot of work, and actually with my first year at OSTI, when Reagan came in, I began at OSTI the day before his inauguration, and immediately he froze the federal government hiring, and he wanted to do away with the Department of Energy. I just joined the Department of Energy the day before. But the first thing we did is, what's the value of the energy database? And we had economists look at it, and we came out with, using the critical incident technique, how did it help you to find information? The numbers were so profound that nobody believed them. But the fact is, if you don't have that knowledge, you can't progress. So how do you really prove that? And everything today with declining budgets is all about metrics. Not just process metrics, but impact metrics. And so I think that's one of the things that's a real thing today that we have to be looking at.
When we talk about metrics, typically we think of quantitative kinds of measures. Would you say that there's a role for qualitative measures as well, or qualitative data as well?
Golden nuggets and stories, which may have quantitative numbers in them, but they're not statistical measures. So they're not quantitative in that way. They're qualitative by stories of this device saves thousands of lives and things like that. In the absence of being able to have the other, which is really the bottom line proof in this zero-sum game world, it's the only thing we have. And so there definitely is a role. If you look at the news today, you see the examples of case studies, golden nuggets, that make an impact on decision making. That's what you're trying to prove. So yes, it does have a place, but it's necessary but not sufficient, or we don't have anything better, so that's what we use. It has to do. It's what we use. It's not ideal, but one of the projects Cindy is undertaking, actually with some other communities, including the technology transfer community. When you look at this iScience to Jobs, there's the technology transfer community, there's the big data community, looking at data and infrastructures. We're trying to get them all together and trying to figure out, how do you really show the impact of this process? What would you do without it? You'd reinvent it, but how do you prove that? So.
I have two questions left that I want to ask. One is, I would like for you to give I'm going to tell you the questions first, and then I'm letting you pick which one to answer. One is just to give us just sort of a basic factual overview of the company, how many employees, that kind of stuff. The other one is that in your biography it mentions that you have lectured on information futures. So we've talked about what the issues are. What is the future? And what would be your parting advice for young professionals just moving forward?
Well, the easy one is statistics about the company. Process statistics, not impact statistics. Information International Associates is, well, this was the question you were going to ask. We actually have, yesterday, Information International was a $20 million company. We had about 180 employees in the U.S. and Europe. This is the first page of all of our briefing presentations. We're in 12 states, the District of Columbia and abroad. We have security clearances. We can work at all kinds of levels of security. We are ISO certified, so we're quality ISO certified, registered company. Kind of our tagline is Navigators in the Sea of Data. Headquartered in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. So that kind of gives you a sense. But as of probably an hour ago, we've just done our first acquisition. And that's pretty exciting. That's like a master's degree in finance in about a month. One I never thought I needed or wanted, but I'm now anointed on myself. And it was very exciting. And we have acquired a $5 million company, and very much in the IT space to supplement our IT capabilities. So now I should say we're a $25 million company with over 200 people, again in the same geographic locations.
Well,
so,
congratulations.
Well, thank you. It was a trial. You watch, we're going to do that in about a week. You watch these movies about acquisitions and mergers, and let me tell you, I could make a movie about how to do the simplest of acquisitions and be up all night trying to send papers up and back and resolve all kinds of things. So it's been really exciting. In fact, that's where I was yesterday and most of the day today. And there, as soon as we get off, I'm going to go see if the money was transferred,
right,
because we're looking at very large money transfers going on today.
Well, congratulations, and I bet this is a different kind of acquisitions than you really thought you were going to get into.
When I got into the library acquisition, you betcha. Okay, so what did you want? A parting?
Information
futures.
Where are we going?
The more things change, the more they stay the same. It is clear in today's world we have too much information. Everybody feels it, the pressure's on it, we have more information than we can absorb. This is not new. The Weinberg Report in 1964 said we have information overload, and the whole concept of analysis was to conquer information overload. We thought technology would solve it. Well, what did technology do? It made it worse. Well, maybe it will solve it, but in the meantime, it's made it a lot worse. So I think the information future is, the last generation was the Google of the world, getting access. The next generation is making that access usable, making that knowledge usable. The future is Star Trek. Computer, tell me this. Watson is a path along there. That's the future. Now you laugh and you say, yeah, sure, we're never going to get to Star Trek's computer. I was just about a year ago reviewing I think it was Xerox, or was it Apple? Apple did the Knowledge Navigator. It was this 10-minute video where they had this guy who had an avatar. This was before the internet, before you really had the World Wide Web, before you had a lot of those things. And we laughed at it. We said, this was, I think, 1989. And we laughed, we said, sure. And how are you ever going to do these things? almost everything in that video is second nature to the young generation. Duh, you know?
Yeah.
And so that Star Trek computer is where we're going. It really is. Now, how we get there and how that really happens is the challenge for us. I think that's what it is. Now, we're back in baby steps. You know, what's the future of repositories and the knowledge network and the knowledge structure? But what we're going is all of that stuff so that you can, through voice, not through keys, ask a question, and through the Watsons of the world networked 1,000 million times, you get your answer. Now, if I knew how to get from here to there, I would be retired.
Have a big company.
I'd be retired. Right. But I think that's what we need to be thinking about. And I think the skills of information professionals, you know, I see all the time government agencies jumping into things and reinventing stuff. Okay, the latest reinvention is, gee, you know, we can't really tell which corporate entity this is. Is MIT the same thing as Massachusetts Institute of Technology? Is the same thing as Massachusetts.MIT. You know, well, you remember back when we were working on creating the database, we had corporate authority files. The computer hasn't conquered that entirely. Now, there are many programs that do a lot of stuff that the general public doesn't have access to. But, you know, these problems are reinventing themselves. So, but somehow we have to get from here into the Star Trek computer. That's where the future is. That's where we're going. And we think it might be 100 years out. It'll probably be 20 years out.
And so for future LIS professionals, your advice would be?
Absorb as much technology as you can, and never lose sight of the fact that it's content that you're working with, and the technology is a means to the end. Now, it just occurred to me, I heard a very bright man, Mike Nelson, who I met when he was a senior staffer Al Gore, back when Al Gore was a senator. He's gone on to do many things. He worked for IBM, and now he's working for CSE in their think tank. He's saying content may no longer be king. Collaboration is king. And there's some interesting things when you look at what's going on in the world about challenges. You know, you throw a problem out and it's solved around the world by the best thinking. Remember the MIT red balloons, and where are they and how do you know? So collaboration is a new way of analysis in some ways. So, but even if collaboration is king, content is still king. So get your technology, don't forget your content, and collaboration is